Welcome everyone to Understanding the Basics of Animal Disease Control and Quarantines. My name is Audrey Thompson, and screen over here. I'm a staff attorney here with the Penn State Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. Next slide, please. The Understanding Agricultural Law educational series is a course designed to provide subject matter literacy and competence on fundamental issues of agricultural law to attorneys and business advisors who work with or represent agricultural or rural clients, but who may not necessarily specialize in agricultural law. This series is wholly sponsored by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's Ag Business Development Center, established the 2019 Pennsylvania Farm Bill. The Agricultural Business Development Center aims to enhance the long-term vitality of Pennsylvania farms by supporting farm transitions, both from generation to generation and from conventional to organic farming, supporting beginning farmers, providing risk management education, and providing financial assistance through low-interest loans and grants. Next slide. As you can see, we've covered numerous topics so far in the Understanding Ag Law series, including ag labor, the Fair Labor Standards Act, ag cooperatives, finance, the farm credit system, crop insurance, conservation programs, Pennsylvania's Clean and Green program. We have multiple webinars on that. Understanding the basics of landowner immunity statutes, right to farm, did I say right to farm? Right to repair, and many, many more. You can find materials and recordings from all of these webinars on our Understanding Ag Law landing page on our website at aglaw.psu.edu. Putting that in the chat right now. Next slide. Upcoming topics in the Understanding Ag Law series include next month, children, minors, and farm work on December 13th. And then for 2025, we've got our whole slate of programming lined up. We've got Pennsylvania's carbon sequestration law for January 24th, and then pesticide drift on February 28th, the Clean Water Act and Ag, focusing on impaired waters and TMDL process on March 24th, and then Pennsylvania ag exemptions for inheritance tax and other real estate transfers on April 25th. Those are all open for registration on our website. It's a pretty simple webpage right now, but you can register for it. And then just verbally, I will let you know, also on our slate, we're looking at Pennsylvania seasonal farm labor law later next year, another Clean and Green looking at county level administration, ADA compliance on agritourism operations, foreign ag land ownership laws, and probably doing a farm bill overview, depending on what happens in Congress in 2025. And then also stay tuned. We are looking to program our Pennsylvania Agricultural Law Symposium again for September of 2025. We'll have more information on that. Before all that, we do have some other sponsored programs. This next month, on December 18th, Brook Duer is going to do complying with new U.S. Treasury beneficial ownership information filing requirements with the Pennsylvania Small Business Development Center, Ag Center of Excellence. And then in January 14th, we've got our quarterly dairy legal webinar. Registration is up for that as well. So if any of that sparks your interest, head on over to our website and go ahead and get registered. Next slide, please. And finally, before we get started, let's do some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A feature. I will collect them and ask them at the end. And we encourage you to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. Tell us what you like, what we can improve, what topics you'd like to see in the future. And if you would like for us to submit this program for free CLE credit to Pennsylvania CLE board, or send you an attendance certificate that you can submit to your state's CLE board, we've posted, yes, thank you for the, it says 2024 on that slide, and then I changed it, and this is still not right. But the slide at the end will say 2025, everything with January, February, that is all 2025. Thank you, Shannon Carpenter. Okay, CLE form is in the chat. If you need that, if you're on the phone, I don't think we've got anybody on the phone, but if you're on the phone, send me an email, aet17@psu.edu. I will send you the link for the form. And I think that's it. So I will now turn this webinar over to the Center's Senior Staff Attorney, Brook Duer. Brook joined the Center for Agricultural and Shale Law in 2019. Prior to coming to the Center, he served as Chief Counsel to Pennsylvania's Department of Agriculture, and before joining PDA, he practiced law in Lancaster County for 18 years. Brook, the screen is yours.
All right, thanks, Audrey. Hope everybody can hear me and see me. Should be no transmission problems here, but if I start getting a note that my signal is not as strong as it should be, I'll cut my video, but I think we'll be okay here. haven't had problems lately. Obviously, we're about into winter here. I don't know where everybody is in the sort of mid-Atlantic region, but I got snow outside my house here in Lancaster. It's sort of snow rain mix maybe. So we're in it now. We're going to talk about animal disease control and quarantines. And here we have, of course, a photograph of some workers, performing some type of disease control or potentially maybe just some investigatory activities within a disease control area. I love that photograph. I do want to just mention one thing before we go on. If you see this slide, you see this is a photograph of one of the most unpleasant experiences, and really none of this is all that pleasant, but certainly necessary. This is if you've never been aware or seen anything like this, this is one of the depopulation methods that are used in poultry disease control. And this is a foamer, much like the foam that you see in firefighting instances. It's a water-based product. And it is used to depopulate. In this case, you see it's a turkey facility, not a pleasant thing. None of this is all that pleasant, and but it's really a pretty obscure area of the law. And I found it very fascinating when I was at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, because so much of it goes on and we just don't know. But yet everything that we're eating, 3 times a day, everything has been subjected to, either contamination controls, general food safety activities, or in this case, disease controls when you're dealing with live animals. And of course, a lot of these same principles all apply in, the production of crops and other types of, plant materials, and disease control in plants and food crops and fruits and vegetables is just as important as in animals. Now, we're going to divide up today and talk about federal legal authority, which is we're going to spend a lot of time on that, and then I will run down for you sort of Pennsylvania's state equivalent. What we have here, in the U.S. system is we basically have, a standard sort of concurrent jurisdiction where you got 2 levels. You have the federal government, and then you have state government. Just about every state has a law that is similar to the federal law that we're going to talk about, and has many, many, many of the same powers. And then generally the duties and the obligations when there is an animal disease outbreak of some kind that needs action or control, then each individual state generally has some type of letters of agreement or MOUs, other types of controlling agreements, which dictate, and they're always evolving and changing with different things that are going on. It's sort of a constant thing. Who's going to do what? And the feds, obviously, the age-old difference between a federal legislature and a state legislature is the whole balanced budget concept. And of course, since the federal government generally is considered not to need a balanced budget, then and state governments are, that we look to the federal government, let's just say, for a lot of the financial support of these types of activities. The Pennsylvania's legislature, however, has been quite generous in some funding that they've appropriated for for losses related to disease control, particularly poultry, in this recent high path avian influenza outbreak. Now, the one thing we're not going to do today is we're not going to talk about HPAI except in the context of these control measures and looking at some of them. And we're not going to talk about what's the latest thing, and we're not going to talk about HPAI and dairy cattle and what's the latest thing. And that would be a subject of that we would need to spend hours and hours on, and there's only a limited amount of time. What we are going to do is arm you with a basic understanding and a reference resource, meaning our PowerPoint, a basic understanding of what the laws are that are involved and generally what they say. And it's quite, I find it very fascinating, perhaps because of how uncomplicated it is, to be honest with you. And again, it's a thing that the general public doesn't know a lot about. Now, if you're a practitioner, and you're looking at the situation of, what do I need to know for this client who might come in the door someday? Generally, the thing that is coming up when a client's coming in is the indemnity portion. In other words, is there money available for animals that I might have lost, et cetera, and the shutdown, the time when I was out of production and not realizing revenue, so we will talk a bit about that as we go forward. So that's today's topic, is going to be concentrating on the law and the very big sort of skeleton of the law. And then there's lots of subtopics we can get into later, but we aren't going to be talking about HPAI and the latest and controversies, et cetera, or latest developments, let's just say. Okay, now, where is animal disease control? Just basic, here's the org chart for the USDA. And if you come down, it's actually under the Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs, which sometimes seems like a little bit of an odd mix. But in any event, an Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which is just, commonly referred to as APHIS, APHIS. And then if you drop down to APHIS's org chart down here, you see that of all the various units in their org chart, veterinary services is right here. And this is that's the particular portion of APHIS that is doing the hands-on, day-to-day administration of animal disease control. Wildlife Services handles wild animals and wildlife disease issues. So, for example, rabies in wildlife comes under Wildlife Services. Veterinary Services, deals with what we would call, at least in Pennsylvania, we call them domestic animals, because that's actually a legal term of art. It's not exactly a legal term of art in the federal system, but and then over here, just since we alluded to it, plant protection and quarantine, that's the whole parallel unit that deals with crops and plant diseases and tree fruit diseases and things of that nature. Very parallel kind of activities and authority that they have too. And now, this is an interesting document, and as maybe a former government lawyer, I have a particular interest in this, which is on the Veterinary Services website. There is a list, which you never see this from government entities. It says, here's all the laws that we administer and enforce, essentially. And so I thought, well, this is worth having, even though it's all lots of tiny type in here. But you see the first one. And I will say, at the Department of Agriculture in Pennsylvania, we, frequently people would say, "Where's the list of all the laws that we administer?" And that's not an easy question to answer all the time, because there's so many bits and pieces all over the place. And so for a federal agency to do this, that's why I find this list to be worth including in here. But the number one law, hands down, is the Animal Health Protection Act. And that is what we're going to talk about here today. That is the kingpin of them all. And that's essentially what most of veterinary services is doing. And if you look through some of these other laws, sometimes they're just a species specific issue that is also, generally dealt with in the Animal Health Protection Act. So, how many times do you have like a state agency where they are just really, or a big, division within a federal agency, I should say, is, really, really dominated by this one law. And that's certainly the case with veterinary services. Now, here is sort of a breakdown. Here's the U.S. code, breakdown of the Animal Health Protection Act, and shows you the citations and all. And it's not very long. I mean, as brief as this looks, that's kind of how brief it is when you start reading through it. So it was reenacted in 2002, excuse me, Farm Bill, reenacted wholesale from bits and pieces of prior enactments. And, but of course, all of these laws, go back to the earlier parts of the 20th century. And some of them, the statutory language still has that kind of age on it. Some not, some has been updated. What's the the basic mission? To prevent and eliminate burdens on interstate commerce and foreign commerce from animal health and animal disease problems. And of course, so you go back to what's the constitutional authority. Of course, it's the Commerce Clause. So probably not surprising that a lot of it does revolve around, okay, what exact, where in commerce is this animal, and where do these, where do we exercise our controls, in the stream of interstate commerce to try to prevent this disease from, becoming worse or, spreading, et cetera. Okay. And again, it's concurrent with the state's intrastate authority. So once you get, to the point of crossing state lines, you've crossed into the Animal Health Protection Act jurisdiction. When you're in the intrastate area, you're well acquainted, most of you, with the expansive view of what interstate commerce entails. So, but there actually is a little bit of mention in here of solely state actions, or and I'll get to it, the federal government's actions within an individual state. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, the states generally, I sort of alluded to this before, they generally depend on USDA in this, structure of concurrent authority for technical assistance. Obviously, these, USDA is capable of a lot more, research, has a lot more technical skill, at least in terms of sheer numbers of veterinarians, et cetera. And of course, they have the powers of the purse and, congressional appropriations in this area. Clearly, the feds, are driving the train, let's just say, with regard to the relationship between the feds and the state entities, because they are, the one who has the power of congressional appropriations. And, most of it's indirect, assistance through research on diseases, which have helped all 50 states, and all 50 states animal health departments, or whatever they might be called. In Pennsylvania, it's called the Bureau of Animal Health within the Pennsylvania Department of Ag. But in the states, it could be, lots of different names used. One of the things that has really kind of brought a lot of these issues up to the top of the pile, so to speak, and made them more visible, is that going back to 2014 -15, I think it started a little bit in 2014, and then through 15, there was a high path avian influenza outbreak that was in Iowa, Minnesota, and South Dakota, I think, was in there. I think Wisconsin had some cases too, and it was primarily turkeys when it was all said and done. But that was a large high path avian influenza outbreak, and it had been the first one for quite a number of years, and was really kind of the thing that started where we are today, or the path that we're on today, with the things that you read about in the ag press with regard to HPAI control efforts going on today, whether it's in poultry or in other animals, specifically dairy cattle. That outbreak taught everybody a lot, and it got everybody ready. In Pennsylvania, I was there at the Department of Ag at the time, doing tabletop exercises and, training on what would happen should this disease get closer to Pennsylvania. It never did. Closest it got in that outbreak was to the state of Indiana, I think. And I don't think Ohio had any cases. But Indiana's pretty darn close, and that was a lot of sweat and a lot of tension in those times. But it also got everybody sharpened up. And not only, at the state level, preparing for what their role might be, but at the federal level. So that's a big event, very historically significant event, and is the reason why I think the country as a whole has survived. You don't want to say survive, because there are certainly producers out there that, the recent outbreak, the 2022 outbreak that then continues to today, has caused the demise of many, 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 poultry producers, and poultry operations, and has certainly done economic damage, on some pretty massive scales. But the preparedness and the actions that were taken and have been taken since 2022 were so much more coordinated and smoother, and there was just so much that was learned from the prior outbreak, and USDA did a lot of work on their regs and all of their internal procedures between the 2020 or the 2015 outbreak and then the 2022 outbreak. So there was the practice in 2015 that was obtained. Unfortunately, it was real, and a lot of economic devastation. In 2022, continuing to today, same thing. High path avian influenza in poultry has caused a lot of economic devastation. But the systems are getting better, and it's certainly running a lot more smoothly, and things just have really taking lessons learned and using them immediately is probably the best way for a government entity to get better at what they do, and that's certainly what's been going on here. Now, COVID, the COVID, human pandemic, did illustrate for people a little bit of what sort of goes on, and so that there's some interesting. I think the public in general has a little bit better grasp of some of these issues than would be the case if we had not been through the COVID situation. Now, the authority in the Animal Health Protection Act is just extremely broad, and that's one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on here, is so that you have a handle on what this, how broad this really is. Here we go. The powers granted to USDA-APHIS under the Animal Health Protection Act are over three main areas: import, meaning bringing into the country; export, things going out of the country; and then interstate movement of animals. And so that's kind of how you want to divide it up, and that's what helps sort of organize things. Now, what's regulated? And pests, which would be as defined here, this I just which is basically some other type of living organism, that meets one of these definitions, which you can see is just about anything, including the same pathogens that would cause what we would normally call a disease. A disease gets this definition under the act that is essentially kind of free floating, so that the secretary can, we got to be ready for unusual circumstances, combinations of of living organisms that are doing destruction to primarily mammals and bird species, so that's kind of how and then livestock is this broad, all farm raised animals are included under the Animal Health Protection Act under the definition of livestock. So it can be all kinds of small little exotic things that you might not normally think of. Could the act has the authority to become involved in disease control in many species that you wouldn't maybe anticipate. It's not a defined list like some livestock. When you go to look in the various definitions of what does livestock mean in this statute or this statute, how it is. You're all over the map sometimes. Here it's really all over the map on purpose. All farm raised animals. Okay. And of course, then you get in there, well, what's a farm-raised animal? What's farm? And then that's a whole nother discussion. Okay, now how do they regulate these particular pests and diseases of livestock in import, export, and interstate movement? Well, through orders and regulations, and that's really the two words where it all starts to flow down. And we all kind of know what regulations are, and most of us are here for the CLE credits and have our law degrees, so we kind of know what that's all about. Very rarely do government entities operate as heavily on orders as USDA does in this particular area of animal disease control. Orders become essentially the main instrument. Let's just say the regulations. You'll see some later. They're not all that detailed or all encompassing because the orders are where it's at. The orders are very, very the authority is broad, and then how their orders are written is very broad because it's got to be essentially a self-contained law and enforcement mechanism with remedies, and all these things have to be contained in a well-written quarantine order is, and we'll get to what that's generally what we're talking about, a quarantine order or something that's classified as a quarantine order. That that is a extremely flexible thing, and it needs to be, because it's got to be applied. And if you are transferring this to the plant pests and diseases, for example, we all live in the land of spotted lanternfly here, and Pennsylvania will never lose that that designation. And that's some of the enforcement with regard to that on the plant side and the plant pest side kind of gives you this idea that, like, spotted lanternfly control involves things like inspecting your car and the wheel wells and the surfaces of your car to make sure you didn't pick anything up that you're going to be transporting elsewhere. It gets into some pretty far-ranging things that don't necessarily have logical, or I should say direct connection immediately is made in your mind as to what does this, why are you inspecting rail cars because you're worried about spotted lanternfly? Well, it's because they lay their eggs on this flat surfaces like a rail car, and those are the perfect places where rail cars are stored. It's a perfect place that where they lay their eggs and where they inhabit to begin with. So it becomes the need for all of this sort of broad-ranging free authority to devise a self-contained way to address a disease or a pest. That is by design, and it's totally necessary. Okay, now orders and regulations can prohibit or restrict importation, entry, or movement, order the destruction, removal, or disinfection of any animal, article, or means of conveyance. Again, just take a whiff of how strong that or how, I should say, how broad that could be. And then the standard that appears in the basic definition of the authority is necessary to prevent the introduction into or dissemination within the United States of any pest or disease of livestock. So necessary to prevent, that's it. But you talk about a broad standard, that's the first definitional standard that we have. And who decides if it's necessary? The Secretary of Agriculture. It's in the discretion of the Department of Agriculture. So that is quite a broad-ranging authority, and that's who would decide what's necessary. Okay, now we talked about that last slide was talking about, let me go back for 1 second. I was talking about importation. You see, I'm talking about, what measures can be taken with regard to importation. And now exportation has the same standard, necessary to prevent dissemination within the country. Interstate movement, same thing, same standard, necessary to prevent the introduction or dissemination within the U.S. Okay. They added an export certification thing at the very beginning of the statute that could have been done probably by a quarantine order that might be like a permanent quarantine order. But the reason that export certification is important, is, in the animal disease area, is that, you need your, let's say your cattle, if they're going overseas or whatever it may be, you need these things to move. You need them to move fast. You need them to spend the least amount of time in the port, the least amount of time on the ship, the least amount of time getting unloaded, all for the animal's well-being. And the country where they're going to be unloaded needs to know that they're okay to unload. And so, that's export certification has its own little niche within the law, because of sort of its importance to the whole process of, exporting. We need to be able to, for economic prosperity of our producers, we need to be able to have a ship containing live animals that is docked in Turkey or wherever it may be. We need to have that be able to be unloaded, in the shortest amount of time and delivered to customers within the shortest amount of time. So that's why it takes special care, and that's why export certification is so important. Also, there's some general reference to enforcement and the enforcement powers again. Take remedial action, destroy, remove from the U.S. the animal or progeny of any animal, article, or means of conveyance, and recover from the owner the costs of any care, handling, disposal, or other action, potentially, if that is, if that needs to happen, if there's a failure to comply with an order. And there are also equitable measures in there, such as obtaining some types of injunctive relief. Luckily, we don't see that a lot because generally, knock on wood, there's cooperation. And generally, when you're in a particular business, you need to preserve your standing within the industry and your ability to work in that industry. And, that certainly goes a lot smoother with cooperation, as opposed to other types of reaction, to, the regulations that may exist. Okay, now, this section 8306 is where the quarantine authority is. And it's broader than that, but it's also about seizing things or disposing of things. And again, you see another statement of very broad authority: may seize, quarantine, treat, destroy, dispose of, etc. Again, you see an animal or progeny of an animal, because there you also have this idea that, not only this animal that is perhaps, has a good, modicum of evidence that it has a particular disease, but other animals, who may be inheriting that disease in some way, shape, or form, contracting that disease, etc. It's broader, because of the transmissible nature of the diseases, and the speed with which they can be transmitted. And then also, and again, this is here to point that out, the secretary, it's things that can be, seized, quarantined, disposed of, etc. Things that the secretary has reason to believe may carry, may have carried, or may have been affected with, and that's the right, they did use the word affected, not infected, may have been affected with or exposed to any pest or disease of livestock. So again, compare that to, the secretary's broad discretion to determine what's necessary, and then you have a very flexible, looser, in comparative terms, standard here that the secretary has reason to believe that something may have qualified here for regulatory intervention. So again, these are broad powers because they kind of have to be. Every diseases and the way they transmit and the way they move, there are just so many things that are, the world cannot stop until you confirm that this particular object is contaminated, or this particular, by lab testing, or that this particular, herd is contaminated, or every animal in it is contaminated, let's say that way. The world cannot stop for that when you're dealing with these types of diseases and the potential consequences. So that's why these things exist. And I'll just say it, I think it's amazing how judiciously these powers have been used over the century, let's just say, that they've existed, and I'm sure there were parts of this that, you know, were on the books and able to, authority was existed prior to 1924, but we'll say a century just around it. Okay, now there's also a situation of extraordinary emergencies, and that can be if the secretary determines that we're in an extraordinary emergency because of the presence of a pest or disease that's threatening livestock. Again, that's the Animal Health Protection Act, the Plant Pest Act, or whatever plant authority exists would just talk about threatening, plants, food production, etc. Would just be substituted for livestock. Hold, seize, treat, plague, and destroy, including preventative slaughter. This is the first place, and I just moved that in red because this is where the first place where the introducing the idea of, as I sort of referenced, depopulating or euthanizing animals that have simply been exposed, but there's not any scientific basis at this moment in time to say they have the disease. However, the known pathways of the disease are being addressed so that in fact they do not become a carrier as quickly as you can take that action to then transfer it to another a member of that species, who then transfers it to another member of that species. So the word preventative slaughter, not a word that it comes up every day, but is a very significant concept that's injected into this, and again, very very significant, and and of course now we've all seen it with anyone who's who's involved in any way, shape, or form, or just reads the papers, knows what's happened with regard to the need to depopulate poultry in large numbers so as to prevent more poultry from getting the disease once it's in your flock, so to speak. Now, one of the things that these extraordinary measures does is if in fact the secretary may take action in a state under this subsection only on a finding that measures being taken by the state are inadequate to control or eradicate the pest or disease after review and consultation with the governor or tribal head. Now, as far as I know, we are in fact in one of these extraordinary emergencies, and that's why this particular notice at the top of the screen appears all over the USDA-APHIS website. Now, I believe that last little bullet has already been taken care of due to cooperative agreements between states and USDA that are put in place in advance of having to do that. In other words, the groundwork is laid so that there is an acknowledgement that when these emergency situations occur, there is a cooperative agreement in place that makes the provisions of the statute already satisfied, so to speak. Okay. And again, this is because the concept, I think, at some point in the drafting, the idea was, well, should we have some limitations on USDA's authority to act in what some might call intrastate, meaning an action within a state that, we don't even have time in these circumstances to, go through the legal, process of establishing that this is interstate commerce that we have jurisdiction over. And again, if you're following the Amos Miller raw milk problem, you may see a little parallel here with where that whole mess is right now legally. Okay, now compensation is such a huge part of all this. Okay, the secretary shall compensate the owner of any animal, article, facility, or means of conveyance that the secretary requires to be destroyed under this section. Fair market value as determined by the secretary, minus any compensation received by the owner, from state or insurance or whatever it may be, is the standard for compensation. Now, of course, fair market value of a diseased bird is nothing. So, this is, the fair market value of this particular animal at its age and development, if it did not, if it had not been exposed or, to this particular disease. So if your birds are already sick, or put it this way, an animal that has been diagnosed positively with a certain condition is essentially not a compensable loss. It is the anticipatory depopulation to prevent spread of that. That's what we're talking about here, paying the fair market value. Because otherwise, a confirmed positive case doesn't have of that animal doesn't have a fair market value. There's no market for it. And now, the determination by the secretary of the amount to be paid shall be final and not subject to judicial review. That's going to be a controversial sentence, to some people. Very controversial sentence. But that is the way the law is written. And, USDA has I'll just say anecdotally, expressed a lot of cooperation through its actions in terms of when people are dissatisfied with compensation amounts, particularly for birds that were depopulated in the HPAI, the recent HPAI outbreaks. Now, payment is essentially you lose your right to payment if you do any of the following things. You moved or handled the animal in violation of an agreement for, sorry, so good I didn't do that. In violation of an agreement for the control and eradication of diseases or pests. In other words, there's a phrase, remember that phrase, agreement for the control and eradication of diseases. We haven't seen a lot of talk of that so far, but we will in a second. And then if you also, if the articles were refused entry at the border, for example, rejected at the border, there's no compensation for that. And there's no compensation if the exposure is, the first bullet was for a violation of an agreement you had with us to do things a certain way. The third bullet is your animals became exposed because of your violation of an agreement. And so a little different, was moved or handled in violation, or they, the movement and handling, has caused them to be exposed. Or maybe that should be an and. No, that's an or. Okay. All right. Other powers. There's a warrantless inspections power, which, we probably, get, for the most part, I think the industry, gets it, but when you say warrantless inspection, that's already somewhat of a lightning rod there. But certainly that is possessed by USDA-APHIS with regard to animal disease. And the standard is actually there's 3 different reasons. And number 2 is the, on probable cause to believe that the person or means of conveyance is carrying any animal or article regulated under this chapter. Well, that doesn't even have to be that that animal has been exposed, to the disease, for example. And then on probable cause to believe the person or means of conveyance is carrying it. Yeah. And then here is, you're actually carrying an article, or excuse me, an animal or an article that is under a quarantine order, and you've moved it in some way in interstate commerce. So that too is interstate, and then intrastate for number 3, when you've something is already subject to a quarantine order. Sorry, I didn't cover that so well, but just you're aware it's there. Warrantless investigatory powers, that prior screen was, for detections of various violations. This is just for, for testing, et cetera. The full scope of investigation authority. And again, there's, some mention of compensation, and I'll just perhaps tell you that there's 2 terms. Compensation means you're getting paid for not for your animals or your eggs, for example. You're getting paid for work you put in to try to control the disease. You disinfected the house. You participated in, and producers themselves get paid by taking their own workforce and helping to do the disease control effort. Depopulating the poultry house, for example, and cleaning and disinfecting, and then they're eligible to receive payment for doing that. And that's sometimes what happens when you have a quarantined premise, and then their workforce ends up working for USDA, and at least there's some wages can be earned in that context, so to speak. Okay, so here's the excuse me, that's compensation. Indemnity is the term of art for paying for the animals. Okay. Now, here are the regs under the Animal Health Protection Act. Again, we're in this process of examining this statute and how broad it is. But then you look in here, these are the regs. This is all there exists of the entire regs under the Animal Health Protection Act. Not that it's, inadequate. It's just that you don't see high path avian influenza in here anywhere. Now, it is buried in Part 53 here. There is low path avian influenza, and I'll just tell you that I'm not the guy that can rattle off the difference, but essentially these are much less virulent, much less subject to widespread and extremely damaging slash guaranteed fatal disease contraction. And low path avian influenza is a thing that is with us. It's been with us. It has its own standing program that is paid for, I believe, 100% by USDA. And actually, Pennsylvania gets reimbursed by USDA for low path activities. I believe the Department of Ag does. But in any event, in Part 53, buried in there is one section, 53.11. It was enacted in 2016 after the outbreak that occurred in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest, and it was revised in 2018 again. And essentially, it only deals with a couple of things. The first thing that it deals with, and again, this is it. I have a couple of slides, and this is the full extent of the regs, and then I'll explain to you why that is in a second. So essentially, the first portion of this section is an ability or an attempt to try to compensate contract growers for the work that they've put in when they're not the owner. Because the problem, of course, that we have is that and I shouldn't say compensation. This is sort of a form of indemnity for a contract grower. That the problem is, of course, the owner of the birds in a poultry situation is the one entitled to the indemnity for the animal that's been lost. Well, these contract growers aren't the owners. Somebody else is the owner. So these people are out all the work that they've put into raising, a broiler for 7 weeks or whatever it may be, and then all of a sudden it has to be depopulated, and there was no traditional avenue. This essentially said, okay, the amount of indemnity that USDA pays, we'll take. It gets complicated, but we'll take that amount and that pays for, let's say, 100,000 broilers, and then you put in how many days were they to be grown out, and then the owner, or excuse me, the grower gets whatever was to be made under the contract. Or I should say, the pro rata, the per day amount of the contract, the gross revenue is paid to the pro rata share is paid to the grower, and then the owner of the bird gets whatever may be left, and it may be nothing at that point, because the amount, or it would be very small because the amount of the indemnity may not be much for certain birds at certain ages. So the bottom line is this attempted to at least provide some modicum of sharing of indemnity payments with contract growers. Should have said that first, and I'd have been done already. All right, now let me see if there's anything else in here that is actually worth going through. Let me see. Yeah, okay. So that gives you the basic gist. Now, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go forward. There's lots more in this. Okay, now, so you see that the regulations particularly for high path, are very, very small, very, very short, and don't deal with the whole, they're not comprehensive regulations. Well, where is everything? What controls? This is where everything is. This is what's called the Red Book. And this is, and again, many of you may know all these things, and a lot more, but I need to target this to, to sort of an entry level view. We can do many more of these later in the future with more detailed. But this is what's called the Red Book, which is the which is a form of there's a whole series of these called Foreign Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Plans, and APHIS has them published, and this is how they look. And essentially, these are guidance documents where USDA-APHIS is creating guidance for its own employees, but it's a public document too, to say, okay, everybody who works for us, this is how you're going to administer, the disease response plan in this Red Book, and it goes through every aspect of it. And public, our employees are going to be doing it this way, and so now you know how it's all going to be done. But it doesn't, of course, it is guidance. So it's not a regulation and it's not a statute. But, we all have seen instances of these in many areas. And this is another version of a guidance document in the traditional, sense of a guidance document. Not a reg, not a statute. Tries to take the, authority of the regs and statutes, put them together with announcements of what it, how the agency will conduct itself in administering that statute and those regs. Now, there are multiple Red Books for different diseases. Here are the full, I shouldn't say, there's four. There's four Red Books. High path, foot and mouth, classical swine fever, and Newcastle disease. And so there's four versions of the Red Book right now for those four diseases. That was someday maybe there'll be more, but the high path avian influenza one is certainly beginning to work out. So that's essentially how they administer the quarantine authority for all forms of animal disease, what we've sort of been through. And it's pretty similar. Now, some of those regs, I should say, let's go back for 1 second. Some of these regs that are in here in the Animal Health Protection Act regs are more detailed than what we just looked at in the high path avian influenza area. But literally, the high path avian influenza, I cut nothing out. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 screens of worth of regulatory text, and that is it. So this is where you go. Now, if you're general practitioner and you want to know more about how these foreign animal disease response plans go, and this is a document on the left side of the screen that is sort of an administrative document that tells the whole world how APHIS will be conducting itself generally with regard to any foreign animal disease. And foreign animal disease is sort of the word foreign in there just means that it's not something that we live with, as a constant in our, in that particular, livestock. Let's just put it that way. The idea that it came from overseas or something of that nature is not really attached to that terminology any longer. Maybe at one time it was, I don't know. But okay, so this is sort of an admin manual on the left. On the right, there's some information here about, just some general statements of what USDA-APHIS sort of wants everyone to know. This is what we do in a general way. We sort of talked about all of that anyway. Now, remember I talked about this phrase, agreement for the control and eradication of diseases or pests. This is the key to everything, because what USDA-APHIS wants to do is they are moving so fast when, an animal disease outbreak needs to be dealt with, that the key sort of trade-off and the key way that they get cooperation is by the promise of indemnity and compensation. So it's the powers of the purse that get the cooperation. And so what APHIS does is there are flock plans and poultry biosecurity plans, and there are various instruments that you need to have either already prepared or have them prepared because they're moving so fast that the USDA wants to know, before you even have a loss, do you have, your flock plan together about what you're going to do when there is a loss, so that we can assess, how well done and, and premeditated and organized were the depopulation or any other efforts that you took that you want to be compensated for now. And of course, if you do certain things, incorrectly, in violation of what you've agreed to in a flock plan, for example, then, you may jeopardize your indemnity. So the entire dynamic is, USDA works on agreements, for the control and eradication of diseases, and, gets agreement up front from producers through a flock plan, how they're going to respond in the disease outbreak. And then there's something to measure, the eligibility for compensation and indemnity against. And so that's kind of the mechanism by which all of this works. Okay, now I'm going to go forward here. Now I'm going to give you a series of resources that, as a general practitioner or whatever, industry you may be in, if you ever run across a need to understand what, how your client, has to deal with USDA and what they have to go through to get indemnity and compensation, these are the documents you look at. This document here that I have noted here is just the overview of the financial and administrative portions of the indemnity and compensation process. Here are a number of other documents that are the same thing. They talk about, for example, and again, I haven't updated these yet. There's nothing for 2024, but there are set, or I shouldn't say that. There are 2024 tables. They're just not embodied in these particular documents. They refer you over to those from these documents. The bottom line is, this is the breakdown of what different species get paid, what the rate of payment is for indemnity, what the rate of payment is for, disinfecting, disposal, and depopulation activities that the bird owner or the contract growers' own employees performed, right alongside the USDA contracted employees, by the way, is usually how it's working. Okay, let's go forward here. And I want to now, one of the things that has people, concerned in the dairy HPAI outbreak is that, well, we did all this really drastic stuff in poultry, but the dairy thing seems to be, going a whole different route, well, with the dairy cattle issue. Well, that's because every disease and every species carries its own features, and every industry and every, method of, distribution, and where are the channels where the animal moves through to get to a market, for example, all different in every species. So of course, the approach to how you control the disease is going to be different with regard to every species. This is the approach that was taken with poultry and HPAI, and they call this stamping out, which is the primary, priority is to, within 48 hours, depopulate that flock, however large it may be, 1 million birds, 100,000 birds, or 10,000 birds. The idea is to try to shoot for this goal of 48 hours. So that's why we lived through this time when there was so much happening in such a short window of time, and it was very drastic. Now, the dairy situation is a totally different thing. You have things started slowly. It's a very expensive animal. The USDA is not ordering that cows be put down, due to, HPAI, because it just doesn't do that. It doesn't, have that kind of toll on a lactating dairy cow. I just learned yesterday from Dr. Hamburg, the state vet, about the one of the things that's starting to happen now that we've had large quantities of dairy cattle. Their production never seems to recover after contracting HPAI. So a lot of these cows now probably will be taken out of production, but not, remember we talked about that term preventative slaughter. It's not going to be in that kind of a context where the USDA is ordering, that to occur in any way, shape, or form, because they're not a transmission risk. Thus far, although dairy cattle numbers are starting to increase in terms of how much has been detected, The rate of spread and is just nothing compared to, not even close to how quickly it affects poultry. And with poultry, it's a fatal disease, period. End of discussion. Dairy cattle, not the case. So, that's why you have different mechanisms to respond. Just like we learned with COVID, there's different things happen that make the control of a disease different for every context, every species, and it's the same here. Okay, now let me do one thing and then I will wrap it. What I've included towards the end of this set of slides is, if we had more time, it would be nice to sort of, this is a set of considerations that USDA has on its website that essentially goes through that concept of what are all the variables that impact the response that's going to be taken. And, things like the transmission characteristics of the disease, the consequences. Does it kill the animal or doesn't it? How closely packed are these animals when they're, when they're being raised, and how close, are they to the neighbor's animals? In other words, do these animals, are they housed, contained, in a finite area where there isn't as much, free transmission potentially? How would it get to a neighbor, and how hard is that process? So, all of these things factor in, social and political acceptance of the response. Depopulating poultry was necessary, but it was also something that people had a little bit of familiarity with. Depopulating cows in a way that, would lead to, large quantities, that's a different story, socially and, politically. And so those are real factors. That's essentially what this discussion in these slides is. And I think that's a really interesting part of this whole, area is, you need to understand, how producers are going to respond, and, what works for them in their particular circumstances. If you have a dairy herd that, at the beginning, HPAI and dairy cattle didn't seem like it was, having an appreciable presence quickly through the barn, so to speak. Now they're finding that it probably did have a quicker spread, but it was having such a negligible impact on the cows, in many instances, that there was no detection. And then there's this old idea of, well, you got to test every cow, and it's like some of these cows, might have contracted it 6 months ago, and it was not even a blip on their milk production. Some different story. Some, it does impact the milk production. So there's a lot of variables here. Okay, now.
All right. Okay, Brooke, we are at 102, so we've got to step it down. This really sets us up for a part 2 where we could maybe dig into state legal authority and do a deep dive here. Right. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that you'll have a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you hopefully next month for understanding the basics of children, minors, and farm work.